The air in the study hall felt thick, heavy with the scent of old parchment and unspoken expectations. Elder Gideon, his beard a silver waterfall against his dark robes, stood at the front, his voice a low rumble that usually commanded instant respect. Today, however, his words cut like a dull knife, aimed directly at me. He was discussing my recent writings on the ancient Hanukkah texts, interpretations I had poured years of my life into. His gaze, usually warm, was now cold, dismissive. Such interpretations, he declared, his voice rising, just enough to carry to the back rows of scholars, are unworthy of the flame. They twist tradition, seeking novelty, where only reverence is required. My heart, for a fleeting second, gave a sharp, painful twitch. It wasn't just a critique, it was a public shaming, a declaration that my life's work, my devotion to these sacred words, meant nothing. His words implied I was not just wrong, but fundamentally flawed, perhaps even disrespectful. He was not merely disagreeing with my scholarship, he was questioning my very soul. The weight of his authority, built over decades of revered teaching, pressed down on me. It was a betrayal, profound and unexpected, from the man who had once encouraged my early inquiries, who had guided my first steps into the labyrinth of ancient wisdom. The sting was sharp, almost physical. Yet a strange calm settled over me. Instead of the anger I expected, a quiet, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips. It wasn't a smile of amusement, but one of knowing, of a secret held close. I met his triumphant, yet now slightly perplexed gaze. His eyes, usually so confident, flickered for a moment, sensing something he couldn't quite place. I spoke then, my voice soft, almost a whisper, but clear enough to cut through the sudden hush in the room. The texts, I began, my eyes still locked with his, also speak of a prophecy, Elder, a forgotten one. It tells of a time when the deepest truths of the Maccabees' struggle will be revealed not by the brightest lamp, but by the smallest, most overlooked flicker. A ripple went through the younger scholars. I saw a few of them. Their faces a mix of confusion and dawning understanding, exchange uneasy glances. They had been taught to revere Elder Gideon, to accept his word as gospel, but my quiet challenge, referencing something they knew existed within the vast canon, yet had never heard him speak of, planted a seed of doubt. Their faith in his absolute authority, once unshakable, was subtly shaken. The air shifted, no longer just heavy, but charged with a new, uncertain energy. A young woman in the second row, a brilliant student named Leah, leaned over to her friend and whispered, barely audible, "The light always finds its way." Her words, simple and profound, resonated with the unspoken truth of the moment. They were not just about the Hanukkah lamps, but about knowledge, about truth, about the relentless way light pierces through darkness, no matter how thick. Elder Gideon's confident posture wavered. His triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a look of guarded suspicion. He had expected an argument, a plea, perhaps even tears, not this quiet, almost serene defiance. What unseen forces had I just set in motion with those few, carefully chosen words? The question hung in the air, a silent promise of a reckoning to come. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. My story, and the elders' part in it, began long before that moment of public challenge. I grew up in a small ancient town nestled in a valley, a place where the scent of baking challah mingled with the dust of centuries-old synagogues. Our community was tight-knit, every family woven into the fabric of daily life. Mornings began with the clang of the blacksmith and the murmur of prayers from the synagogue, evenings with shared meals and stories passed down through generations. Hanukkah wasn't just a holiday, it was the rhythm of our winter, the glow of the menorah reflecting in every window, a constant reminder of enduring light. From a young age, I was different. While other children played in the dusty streets, I found solace, and later, fascination within the pages of old books. The synagogue library, a quiet sanctuary filled with the scent of aged parchment, became my second home. I wasn't particularly outgoing. A quiet nature made me more comfortable with ancient wisdom than with boisterous games. My mind was drawn to the subtle nuances, the forgotten footnotes, the interpretations of Hanukkah that lay just beneath the surface of common understanding. I yearned for intellectual recognition, a quiet validation of the intricate connections I saw in the texts. This yearning was particularly strong when it came to Elder Gideon. He was a giant in our community, not just in stature, but in intellect and presence. His sermons were legendary, his knowledge of the Torah seemingly endless. He was the one who first noticed my quiet dedication, my early, clumsy attempts to decipher complex passages. Elder Gideon became my mentor, a figure of immense respect. He encouraged my studies, praised my insights, and often spent hours with me in the library, guiding my young mind through the intricate pathways of Jewish law and lore. He was the one who first put the obscure Hanukkah texts into my hands, suggesting there was more to uncover than met the eye. He unknowingly fostered the very ideas, the very independent thought that he would later publicly condemn. I remember one afternoon, the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows of the synagogue, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. I was perhaps 10 years old, struggling with a particularly dense commentary on the Maccabees. Elder Gideon sat beside me, his voice a low rumble, explaining how the written word was merely a gateway, and the true meaning often lay hidden, waiting for a curious heart to find it. He spoke of layers of interpretation, of secrets veiled in plain sight. He told me that the most profound truths were often overlooked, dismissed as too simple or too complicated. Those early lessons shaped me, giving me permission to look beyond the obvious, to question, to seek deeper understanding, even when others were content with the surface. My deep personal investment in the Hanukkah teachings wasn't just academic, it was woven into my very being, nurtured by the elder himself. Every year, as the days grew shorter and the first candle of Hanukkah was lit, I felt a connection not just to the historical miracle, but to the ongoing quest for light and truth in the world. The festival for me became a living narrative, full of hidden messages about perseverance, about the courage to stand for what is right, even when alone. The relationship with Elder Gideon was long-standing and complex. He had been my guide, my inspiration, the one who saw potential in a quiet boy lost in books. He taught me the value of scholarship, the beauty of tradition, and the importance of asking questions. Yet, over the years, as my questions led me down paths he hadn't explored, as my interpretations began to diverge from his established views, a subtle shift occurred. The encouragement turned into caution, the praise into subtle redirection. The man who had ignited my intellectual curiosity slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to dim my flame. This made his public dismissal not just an attack on my work, but a profound personal blow, a betrayal of the very foundation he had helped me build. It felt like a part of my own history, a piece of my personal journey, was being ripped away by the very person who had guided me to its beginning. The shift in Elder Gideon wasn't sudden. It was a slow, almost imperceptible erosion, like water wearing away stone. At first, his assurances of support for my unique interpretations of the Hanukkah texts were genuine. He'd nod, his eyes thoughtful, and say things like, "An interesting perspective, my son. Keep digging." But as my insights grew bolder, venturing further from traditional understanding, those assurances began to ring hollow. The nods became less frequent, replaced by a slight frown, a tightening around his mouth. He'd still say, "Keep digging," but the tone had changed, carrying a subtle warning, a hint that perhaps I was digging too far, too deep, into places he didn't want explored. Then came the subtle dismissals, often disguised as wisdom. I remember presenting a new connection I'd found between a passage in the Talmud and a less-known midrash about the oil lamp. I was excited, feeling I'd uncovered something truly profound. Elder Gideon listened patiently, then cleared his throat. "That's a creative thought," he'd said, his voice smooth. "But sometimes creativity can lead us astray from the established path. The wisdom of generations is not to be lightly dismissed for a novel idea." It wasn't a direct rejection, but it planted a seed of doubt, making me question my own findings. These became regular occurrences in our private study sessions. He would subtly belittle my insights, always under the guise of constructive criticism. I'd share an interpretation that excited me, and he'd respond with, "You're young, you see things with fresh eyes." But the true depth comes from understanding the established commentators, not always seeking a new way. It made me feel foolish for even trying, for daring to think I could add something new. He wasn't yelling or being openly hostile. It was far more insidious. He was chipping away at my confidence, making me question my own intellectual compass. His tactics to maintain intellectual dominance were clever. He would subtly steer community discussions away from my perspectives. If I brought up a point during a public study group, He'd acknowledge it briefly, then quickly pivot back to his own established views, or those of other revered scholars. It was as if my voice, while heard, was never given enough weight to truly resonate. People would listen politely to me, then turn their attention back to Elder Gideon, whose words always carried the final authority. It was a quiet way of saying, my voice is the one that matters here. There were moments of injustice that stung more deeply than others. I recall an instance where I had spent weeks researching a particular aspect of Hanukkah, finding a rare commentary that illuminated a difficult passage. I shared my findings with Elder Gideon, beaming with pride. A few weeks later, during a sermon, he presented the very same insight, almost word for word, without once mentioning my name or my research. He even used some of my specific phrasing. I sat there in the synagogue, a knot forming in my stomach, listening to my own discovery being delivered as his own. It wasn't the recognition I craved, but the quiet theft of my intellectual labor that left a bitter taste. These incidents, accumulating over years, fostered a quiet resentment within me. The public dismissal of my work, that moment in part 1, wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of psychological and intellectual wear. It was the final, public blow after countless private cuts. Every time he subtly dismissed my ideas, every time he claimed my insights, every time he made me feel small for daring to think differently, it built up. That public moment was just the grand finale of a long, painful performance. A performance where I was slowly being erased. The emotional atmosphere within the community became increasingly strained as my interpretations continued to diverge from Elder Gideon's. What started as subtle disagreements over Hanukkah texts slowly morphed into something more frequent and, at times, almost public. People started noticing. When I'd bring up a point in a study group, there would be a beat of silence, a quick glance between some of the younger members, before Elder Gideon would smoothly redirect the conversation. It was never an open fight, but the tension was definitely there, hanging in the air like an unspoken question. Whispers began to circulate. I'd catch snippets of conversations after synagogue, hushed tones discussing the growing intellectual divide between the elder and myself. Some saw it as healthy debate, a sign of intellectual vitality. Others, the more traditional ones, viewed it with unease, seeing it as a challenge to established authority, a disruption of the peace. This created an undercurrent of discomfort, a sense that something was shifting and not everyone was happy about it. The community, once a single voice, was starting to develop a subtle, almost imperceptible crack. The social pressures intensified dramatically. I started feeling the weight of unspoken expectations to conform to Elder Gideon's teachings. Some members, perhaps out of loyalty or fear of challenging the respected elder, began to subtly ostracize me. Invitations to Shabbat dinners became less frequent. When I would offer an opinion in a community meeting, some would avoid eye contact. It wasn't blatant rejection, but a slow, chilling withdrawal. It made me feel like I was on the outside looking in, observing a world I once belonged to, but was now slowly being pushed out of. The message was clear, though never spoken. Fall in line or stand alone. Elder Gideon, for his part, became even more rigid and dismissive. He saw my evolving interpretations not as intellectual inquiry, but as a direct challenge to his authority, to the very tradition he embodied. His responses to my questions in public became sharper, less patient. He'd often preface his answers with phrases like, "as has been understood for generations," or "the wisdom of our fathers teaches us," directly contrasting it with what he saw as my deviation. He wasn't just disagreeing with my ideas, he was framing them as dangerous, as a threat to the very fabric of our shared faith. It was a subtle but effective way of turning the community against me without ever directly saying anything negative about my character. He made it about tradition versus innovation, with innovation being the clear enemy. I started to experience the full burden of community judgment, the constant pressure to abandon my unique path, to simply accept the established narrative without question, felt suffocating. Every interaction, every glance, every subtle shift in conversation felt like a judgment. It was exhausting. I spent nights awake, wrestling with doubt, wondering if I was indeed wrong, if I was being foolishly stubborn. The weight of it all pushed me to the brink of an emotional breakdown. There were days I felt I couldn't breathe, that the expectations and disapproval of everyone around me were crushing me. I felt isolated, alone, and increasingly desperate for some kind of validation, some sign that I wasn't just chasing a mirage. I was so close to giving up, to just falling silent and letting Elder Gideon win. The desire to simply disappear, to stop fighting, was almost overwhelming. The desire to simply disappear, to stop fighting, was almost overwhelming. Then something shifted. It wasn't a sudden burst of inspiration, but a quiet, persistent whisper in the back of my mind, pushing me towards a different path. I remembered old stories, tales of hidden wisdom, of texts locked away for centuries, waiting for the right moment to be rediscovered. Our synagogue, like many ancient ones, had an archive, a place filled with forgotten scrolls and dusty tomes, rarely disturbed. It was a long shot, a desperate hope, but I had nothing left to lose. I started spending my evenings in that archive, long after everyone else had gone home. The air was thick with the smell of old parchment and dust, a scent that usually brought comfort, but now felt heavy with the weight of expectation. I meticulously went through box after box, scroll after scroll, my fingers tracing faded Hebrew letters, searching for anything, any small detail that might support my evolving understanding of Hanukkah. Most of it was exactly what I expected: commentaries, legal rulings, liturgical poems, all echoing the established narratives. But I kept going, driven by that stubborn inner voice that refused to be silenced. Weeks turned into months. My eyes grew tired, my back ached, but the search became a quiet obsession. Then, one cold evening, tucked away in a corner behind a stack of much newer prayer books, I found it. A small, unassuming wooden chest, its latch rusted shut. It took some effort to pry open, and inside, wrapped in a brittle linen cloth, were several scrolls. They looked different from the others, older, the script unfamiliar in places. My heart started to pound. Unrolling the first scroll, I realized these weren't just old texts. They were ancient, far older than anything else in our synagogue's collection. The language was an archaic form of Hebrew, interwoven with cryptic symbols and phrases I'd never encountered in my years of study. I spent the next few days, then weeks, deciphering them, working in secret, fueled by an almost manic energy. As I pieced together the fragments, a breathtaking picture began to emerge. These texts spoke of Hanukkah, not just as a victory of light over darkness or a miracle of oil, but as something far deeper. They detailed a lineage of spiritual understanding, a connection to ancient wisdom that had been deliberately obscured, almost erased over generations. They described a time when the festival was understood as a moment for profound introspection, for seeking inner illumination, for recognizing the divine spark within each individual rather than solely focusing on external miracles or military triumphs. What truly stunned me was that these texts didn't just validate my unique interpretations. They exposed a historical misinterpretation, a deliberate shift in focus perpetuated by generations of elders. It wasn't a malicious act, perhaps, but a gradual narrowing of perspective, a simplification that had slowly stripped Hanukkah of its deeper, more inclusive spiritual messages. Elder Gideon and those before him hadn't been wrong out of malice, but had simply inherited and reinforced a limited, truncated version of the truth. This discovery was a profound moment of intellectual vindication. It was like finding the missing pieces to a puzzle I'd been trying to solve my entire life. The texts didn't just confirm my ideas, they expanded them, giving them a historical and spiritual depth I hadn't even imagined. They broke the cycle of suffering I had endured, the constant feeling of being wrong or misguided. They shifted the narrative power dynamic entirely. I wasn't just an upstart challenging tradition. I was a conduit for forgotten truth, a voice for wisdom that had been silenced. The unearthed texts contained prophecies and teachings that shed new light on the true meaning of Hanukkah, connecting it to a broader, more inclusive spiritual path that the elder had, perhaps unknowingly, actively suppressed. It spoke of unity, of inner light, of a universal message that transcended the specific historical event. It was a revelation that promised to reshape not just my understanding, but potentially the entire communities. The knowledge was exhilarating, but also terrifying. I held in my hands the potential to either heal or shatter everything I knew. The immense weight of this discovery pressed down on me. It wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a bomb ready to go off in the heart of our community. I grappled with how to reveal this truth, the potential for upheaval churning in my gut. My hands trembled as I carefully re-rolled the ancient scrolls, placing them back in their hidden chest. The euphoria of discovery was quickly giving way to a chilling fear. How could I, a quiet scholar, challenge an elder revered by generations? The thought of standing against Elder Gideon, exposing what amounted to an ancestral oversight, filled me with dread. I imagined the faces in the synagogue, their shock, their anger. Would they see me as a truth teller or a destructive iconoclast? The shame of fracturing our deeply traditional community, of being the one to cast a shadow on our shared history, was almost unbearable. Every night, I would lie awake, the words of the scrolls echoing in my mind, battling with the image of our community torn apart. One evening, unable to bear the burden alone, I sought out Sarah, a close friend and fellow student of texts, though she leaned more towards the elders' established views. We met in a quiet corner of the community garden, the scent of night-blooming jasmine heavy in the air. I started slowly hinting at my recent studies, watching her eyes carefully. Then, with a rush of words, the full emotional explosion came out. I poured out years of suppressed frustration, the subtle dismissals, the veiled humiliations, the constant feeling of being intellectually stifled. Finally, I revealed the scrolls, the ancient words, and their devastating implications. Sarah listened, her face a mixture of disbelief and growing concern. This changes everything, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But Gideon, the community? Her words mirrored my own fears. She understood the gravity of challenging the established order, the deep-seated respect for tradition that ran through our people. She didn't immediately offer solutions, but her presence, her quiet understanding, was a lifeline. It was a private, agonizing confrontation, not with an adversary, but with a confidant who now shared the immense weight of my secret. Word of my intense solitary study had, of course, reached certain ears. Some younger scholars, already questioning the elders' rigid interpretations and drawn to my more inclusive approach, began to seek me out, cautiously. They had seen the subtle shifts, the elders' growing intolerance for differing views. They didn't know the full truth of the scrolls, but they sensed a deeper understanding in my words, a resonance that the elders' teachings lacked. They became my secret allies, offering cautious support, asking probing questions that showed their openness to new ideas. They were a small but vital glimmer of hope. Conversely, many elder members of the community, deeply entrenched in tradition and unshakable in their faith in Elder Gideon, became unwitting obstacles. Their casual comments about the elder's wisdom, their reinforcement of his authority in daily conversations, felt like invisible walls rising around me. They weren't malicious, but their unwavering loyalty to the status quo made my task seem even more impossible. The cultural dynamics of our community dictated a cautious, often indirect response to any unfolding crisis. Open debate was rare. Gossip and hushed conversations were the usual channels for discontent. The psychological impact of bearing this truth, of knowing I held something that could either destroy or redefine our world, was profound. Every interaction felt layered with unspoken meanings, every smile or frown a potential judgment. I was walking a tightrope, knowing one wrong step could send everything crashing down. The weight of the scrolls, the truth they held, pressed on me, but Sarah's quiet support and the cautious interest of the younger scholars gave me a new kind of strength. I knew I couldn't keep this secret hidden. The truth, like the light of Hanukkah, needed to shine. I spent countless hours meticulously preparing my presentation. It wasn't just about showing the ancient texts. It was about weaving their meaning into the fabric of our community's understanding, connecting the forgotten prophecies to our present-day celebrations. I cross-referenced, translated, and organized, building an argument that was not just intellectually sound, but emotionally resonant. My goal wasn't to tear down, but to build up, to enrich our heritage, not diminish it. I chose the annual Hanukkah celebration as the forum. It was the most public, most sacred gathering of the year, a time when our community came together to remember the miracle of light and dedication. It felt right, almost destined, for the truth about Hanukkah to emerge during its namesake festival. The air that evening was filled with the familiar smells of latkes and burning oil from the menorahs, a comforting aroma that brought back childhood memories. Elder Gideon stood on the dais, his voice booming as he began the traditional blessings, his presence as imposing as ever. I stood among the congregation, the carefully prepared scrolls hidden beneath my cloak, my heart thumping a rhythm against my ribs. When the time came for the customary teachings, I stepped forward. A hush fell over the crowd. Elder Gideon looked surprised, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. I began by speaking of our shared history, of the beauty of our traditions, and the endless search for deeper understanding. Then, slowly, I unveiled the ancient texts. I spoke of the scribal errors, the subtle misinterpretations that had crept into our teachings over centuries, and how these new scrolls brought us back to the original, more expansive truth. I presented the evidence clearly, calmly, letting the words of our ancestors speak for themselves. The younger scholars exchanged knowing glances, their faces alight with understanding. Elder Gideon initially tried to dismiss my findings. He interrupted, his voice sharp, questioning the authenticity of the scrolls, calling them an unfortunate distraction. But I was ready. I had anticipated his reaction and had prepared counter-arguments, showing how the script matched other known ancient writings, how the content resonated with other forgotten fragments. The evidence was irrefutable. As I continued, his protests grew weaker, his authority visibly shrinking before the eyes of the community. His usual booming voice became a mumble, his shoulders slumped. He was cornered, not by me, but by the truth itself. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of generations, he acknowledged the historical error. It wasn't a grand apology, but a quiet, public concession that shook the very foundations of his long-held respect. The community didn't erupt into chaos. Instead, there was a quiet, almost reverent acceptance. People murmured, not in anger, but in wonder. Some looked at the elder with pity, others at me with a new kind of respect. The immediate outcome was not a dramatic downfall, but a subtle shift. Elder Gideon, though still a respected figure, lost his absolute authority. His words no longer carried the same unquestionable weight. He continued to serve, but a new openness, a willingness to question and explore, began to bloom in our community. Slowly, over the following months, our community began to integrate this new understanding of Hanukkah. The festival became richer, imbued with a deeper, more authentic interpretation of our heritage. We talked about the true meaning of the oil, not just as fuel for light, but as a symbol of the enduring quest for knowledge. I found myself becoming a guiding light, not as an elder, but as a scholar who had dared to seek and share the truth. People came to me with questions, eager to learn, eager to understand. My lifelong devotion, once dismissed, was now celebrated. The story concludes with a reflection on the enduring power of truth. It showed me that questioning established narratives, even those deeply ingrained, is not an act of disrespect, but an act of profound love for tradition. The true meaning of the Hanukkah lights, I realized, was not just a remembrance of a past miracle, but an ongoing illumination of knowledge and understanding. A constant reminder that the light always finds its way, guiding us toward a richer, more inclusive spiritual path.